or let me call the panelists that are going to be dealing with Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. And I would like to call on stage Dr. Anaheed, Al-Hardan, Dr. Mkawasi, Mcharo Hall, and Dr. Shomarka Keita, and of course, Dr. Oluwakemi Damola Adejumo Aibio. I hope I'm doing it right. Yes. I'm just going to pull this a bit so that I can see them. So, before we start, I was thinking about how am I going to introduce this very important panel, and I needed to find a prayer that is symbolic of this very same panel that is going to be dealing with Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. And let's hear the prayer that I selected just for this moment.
Africa, my Africa, Africa of proud warriors in ancestral savannas, Africa of whom my grandmother sings on the banks of the distant river. I have never known you, but your blood flows in my veins. Your beautiful black blood that irrigates the fields, the blood of your sweat, the sweat of your work, the work of your Savior. Africa, tell me, Africa. Is this your bag that is unbagged? This bag that never breaks under the weight of humiliation. This bag trembling with red scars and saying no to the whip under the midday sun. But a grave voice answers me, impetuous child, that tree, young and strong, that tree over there, splendidly alone amidst white and faded flowers. That is you, Africa, springing up anew, springing up patiently, obstinately, whose fruit, bit by bit, acquires the bitter taste of liberty.
I thought it was an appropriate prayer to start with this session. But before we start, let me just reflect on what this panel is about. So we are dealing with very elusive concepts or theme, which is Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. So today we are going to hear from eminent scholars reflecting on their individual papers these two very important concepts, one being Pan-Africanism, which is based on the belief that unity is vital to the economic, social, and political progress in its aim to unify and uplift people of African ancestry. And as espoused by key figures that some of you know, past and present, whether it was Kwame Nkrumah, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Julius Nyerere, Robert Sobukwe, Frantz Fanon, and many others, including today, Ibrahim Traore. What an elusive concept this Pan-Africanism still is today. They will also reflect on African Renaissance, and we'll also hear them unpacking another elusive concept, the African Renaissance, which envisions a rebirth and renewal of African culture, society, and development, primarily focusing on overcoming the challenges faced by the continent. And of course, you can't deal with this without name-dropping again the likes of Sheikh Anta Diop, Ivan Van Sertima, Thabo Mbeki, and many others. And I guess there is no moment in time than now for Africa to find Afrocentric solutions to the problems that we are dealing with. So we are joined on stage, as you can see, by the four presenters. There are five now. I don't know who's the fifth. I've not been given the name of the fifth, but let me read the ones that I have in front of me. And I guess as I mentioned your names, it means you will be starting in that sequence. There will be a reflection on the African Renaissance, African freedom in Cairo between 1957 and 1964, 2 years after I was born. The presenter is Anaheed Al-Hardan from Howard University. And then the second one will be Pawns to Players, Transforming the African Identity, by Mkawasi Mcharo Hall, also from Howard University. And then, of course, what we say in isiZulu, esihlangene ngaye, the one we are gathered about here, which is Dr. Paul Zeleza, who will also reflect on Africa, African diasporas, Pan-Africanism, and the issue of definitions. The fourth one, actually, I think there is the fifth one. It's just they didn't number it. They did not. Yeah, I don't know. But let me read it. What I'm seeing here is Shomarka Keita, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Washington, D.C. And what I see is the African Development Agenda and the African Renaissance. Insights from Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. That's what I'm reading here.
The paper that you read before about definitions is the paper I'm giving.
That's the one that we are giving. Okay, I think there is in the program a mix-up. Then we've got Oluwakemi Damola Adejumo Aibio, Investor of South Africa. I don't have the title of the paper.
Wow.
Yeah, here, but that will be the fifth presenter. So we have 5 presenters, and we have 1 hour, 30 minutes. Sorry? Yes, I know. Yeah, it's on the board. I'm saying we have 5 presenters. We have 1 hour, 30 minutes. And I'm just wondering, Chair, that we should try and give them 15 minutes each and see. But I'm not sure how we're going to do with the time, with the number of presenters we have. Okay, can I then call you, Prof, to come? Thank you. A round of applause for the next presenter. Yes, let's try. Yes, I will.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Howard University. For those of you who are joining us from beyond Howard, and a good morning to my colleagues. I want to begin by thanking the conference organizing committee for inviting me to present today and to say happy birthday to Professor Zeleza. The paper I will present today is part of a larger book project I'm currently undertaking, so I'm going to say a few words about the book project to set the context for my paper. My book project is centered on the intellectual networks of the African-Asian anti-colonial movement in the aftermath of the Second World War, as centered in and around Cairo. The kind of late 1950s is the period I examined to the early 60s before the Sino-Soviet split is important for my particular research project, because that's the period in which the joint British, French, and Israeli attack on Egypt in October 1956, after the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal, was repelled within the context of the Cold War. This propelled the Egyptian leader, Jamal Abdel Nasser, as an important anti-colonial third worldist leader on the continent, in the Arab world, and in the so-called third world more broadly. So in late 1957, and only 2 years after the Bandung Conference of 1955, and after the nationalization of Suez, Egypt hosted the African-Asian People's Solidarity Conference, which was attended by 580 delegates from 48 countries. And this conference led to the establishment of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization and a permanent secretariat in Cairo. The organization continues to exist today on an island in the Nile River in Cairo. So with its permanent secretariat in the capital, the delegates, activists, writers, and intellectuals associated with APSO hailed from different anti-colonial national liberation movements, including the sizable number of African liberation movements that were given political asylum by Egypt and hosted by its African Association, and post-colonial political parties and movements in Africa and Asia. APSO's self-declared aims were broadly centered on unity and anti-colonial solidarity across the African and Asian worlds. Transnationally, the first decade of APSO's existence saw a flurry of activities by the organization that attempted to further its self-declared aims, including conferences in the newly independent Guinea-Conakry in 1960, Tanzania in 63, and Ghana in 65, and the laying of the groundwork to bring South America to its African-Asian organizational solidarity structure through the Tricontinental Conference in Havana in 66. At the same time, in Egypt, APSO hosted African-Asian youth, women, and writers' conferences and African-Asian Film Festival, and engaged in a trilingual Arabic, English, and French program of publication that included a bulletin, an academic journal, a writer's journal, commission studies, and organizational materials. So my book uses APSO as one of the main loci through which to investigate African-Asian anti-colonialism in North Africa and West Asia, and its networks of activists and intellectuals in Cairo and beyond, within the context of this period's political intellectual milieu of late 1950s and early 60s Cairo. One of the chapters of my book is on the African Renaissance, which is the name of a magazine that was published in Arabic out of Cairo, and I'll talk more about it today in the rest of my presentation. So the first issue of the African Renaissance was published in November 1957 by the African Association in Cairo. The association was headed by the Egyptian scholar Abdelaziz Ishaq, previously at the University of Khartoum in Sudan, who also became the editor of the new journal. The association was initially set up to oversee the affairs of the African students in Egypt, under the African Affairs Bureau of the new Jamal Abdel Nasser-led revolutionary regime in Egypt. The association, enabled by the state's anti-colonial ideological orientation and strategic objectives, became a meeting point of the African liberation movements that were welcomed politically and supported materially by the new regime in Egypt. So Mohammed Fayet, who was one of the free officers who led the military coup alongside Nasser, known as the July Revolution of 1952 that ousted the British-era monarchy, was assigned by Nasser to work with the General Intelligence Command of the new regime. And there he led the African Affairs Bureau until 65. In an oral history interview with Hilmi Sha'rawi, who's an Egyptian Africanist, he passed away a couple of years ago, but very well-known scholar in Egypt and across the continent. He was actually an aide of Fayet, and in the 1950s accompanied him between the African Affairs Bureau and the more than 20 National Liberation Movement offices in Zamalek and missions to some African capitals after independence. Through this oral history interview with Fayet, Hilmi Sha'rawi says that Fayet asserts the strategic importance of Africa and Nasser's threefold vision of what Nasser laid out as Egypt's circles of meaning that all are also, quote, the theater of our activity. So after the July Revolution, Nasser published a book called The Philosophy of the Revolution, which he reflected on Egypt, and he made the claim that the Arab, African, and Muslim worlds in which Egypt is embedded was the theater of Egypt's meaning and geopolitical strategic objectives. So Fayet personally sought out, as a result of this orientation, Fayet personally in this oral history interview says, he sought out African anti-colonial activists among the Al-Azhar students as the new regime strove to gather information about their countries, and this is how the African Association was established as a home for these students. So Sha'rawi states, and I'm going to quote from him here, "I personally witnessed how some of the students became leaders of national opposition groups or liaison officers with their national leaders, who arranged for those leaders to be invited to Egypt and meet with those responsible for African affairs in the country. Other Islamic personalities from Chad, Senegal, Nigeria, and Ghana visited Egypt in those days and were welcomed into the African League, where we made their most instructive acquaintance," end quote. So similar to the question of pan-Arab anti-colonial national liberation, African anti-colonial liberation was central ideological pillar. of the Egyptian regime, particularly as it pertained to fighting the French, British, and the Italians in North and East Africa at the time. Given the strategic importance, eventually an African Affairs Office headed by Fayet was established directly under the presidency in 1960. So this was the milieu that created and enabled the African Association, its main publication. At the association, Sha'rawi states, Fayet met the concepts and efforts of some intellectuals, researchers, and businessmen and former diplomats. The association and its periodical, The African Renaissance, were the first attempt of Egyptian cultural society to look at Africa. I would add here my personal testimony as the person responsible for relations with African national liberation movements within the framework of the African League, the latter being a main source of live information. Fayet would invite interested pressmen and writers to frequent the League and get first-hand information there. So in this presentation, I want to consider the African Renaissance, the journal, as a place where the theorization of Arab-African solidarity was enabled, and where the very imagination and reimagination of Africa and of Arabs as a part of it, and on anti-colonial terms, was made possible. And in so doing, I draw on Professor Zeleza's 2005 keynote lecture, which he kindly shared with me, in Sweden on, what does it mean? What does Africa mean? What are the different meanings of Africa? And I'm going to quote from him, with him present in the audience, which is, always nervous for, so hopefully I'm doing, my reading of your work is kind of does it justice. So I'm quoting him here. Africa is as much a reality as it is a construct whose boundaries, geographical, historical, cultural, and representational, have shifted according to the prevailing conceptions of global racial identities and power and African nationalism, including Pan-Africanism, end quote. For me, such a historically grounded approach moves beyond the and for building on Professor Zeleza's work, it moves beyond the mystical view of Africa as race that is often advanced through an underlying assumption of the cultural unity of the Euro-colonial construct of course, so-called sub-Saharan Africa, and the exclusion of the allegedly culturally homogeneous and non-African North. So in this keynote of Professor Zeleza, he contends, and I'm quoting him here, Eurocentric and Afrocentric representations of Africa are so deeply implicated with each other, and the inclusion or exclusion of North Africa is so crucial to both of them, and their discursive possessiveness centers on Egypt. So I think that Zeleza is arguing that we must distinguish between historical knowledge and ideas or imaginings of Africa as intellectual and ideological projects. And he urges us to ask questions such as, quote, who is defining Africa and for what purpose? Whose ideas and imaginings predominate and why? End quote. And in this article of mine, I propose to pursue this kind of intellectual genealogy project through an analysis of some of the most common themes that emerged through the reading of the 75 issues of the African Renaissance that we were able to locate in Cairo. They were, in the Arabic language, published between 57 and 64. And through this reading, what I really try to demonstrate is how and to what end anti-colonial Pan-African consciousness was theorized in Arabic in late 1950s Cairo under the auspices of the African Association and through its networks of anti-colonial African activists and students. So in my kind of preliminary data analysis, I think I have about 4 minutes to talk to you about that. Me and my team, this was part of a research project that I led. So me and my research team, we kind of analyzed these 75 journals. We looked at editorials. We were particularly interested in how the editorials were speaking to current events in Africa, how Hamad Abdelaziz Ishaq was kind of, positioning his idea of Pan-Africanism vis-a-vis critique of unfolding events. And how he also wrote about the ongoing Afro-Asian conferences, for which Pan-Africanism was, of course, a central part of these conferences. And always from an anti-colonial perspective. We also looked at Hilmi Sha'rawi's articles. who I had mentioned earlier, the Egyptian Africanists, who was central in the association, but also central to the magazine, and how he kind of was his articles were largely related to criticism of culture and arts as it related to Africa, and as produced and published in North America and Western Europe. And he tries to create a genealogy of that. There's also interest in the diaspora. There is a limited number of articles on that, but I think there is clear interest. For example, there's articles that look at the debates between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, and make the claim that these kind of debates in the USA at the turn of the 19th century really come from a notion of African cooperation, something that we can trace later to, other African thinkers and leaders like Kenyatta and Nkrumah. And others are critical of African American production of knowledge about the continent, looking at HBCU's role in serving, international relations and U.S. government production about the government. About the continent of Africa for U.S. Strategic geopolitical interests. There's also quite a lot on, of course, Arab history and politics in Africa, and I think this is probably one of well, for me, in terms of my research project, it really interests me, and one of the important contributions, this idea of several issues discuss the history of the Arab people in or with Africa in terms of, for example, Egyptian Sudanese histories, travel histories between Yemen, Oman, and Zanzibar, even trying to re-envision the Nile River and the Nile Basin as one geographical, cultural entity, which the British came and abruptly kind of stopped or for their own objectives in East Africa. And there's also another important theme on Afro-Asian solidarity, which was increasing at the time. And we also mapped articles on the role of Egypt in kind of Pan-Africanism, and how the magazine itself also becomes a mouthpiece for Pan-Africanist leaders. So there are articles and translation of articles particularly from Nkrumah and from Kenyatta. There are other themes that relate to gender, to history, culture, archaeology, folklore. It's quite a fascinating and wide-ranging magazine, a lot to work with, a lot to go back to, trying to understand these kind of how historically Africa was written about, envisioned, and thought about by Arabs living in North Africa as a fundamental part of the continent. And I think this ends my 15 minutes here, but I'm happy to discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Right on time. Actually with 3 minutes to spare. Thank you so much. We will reflect on the presentations after everyone has spoken. I think that's what we should do. I think I'm going to rely on the screen now because this is the most accurate. So the next presentation is Pawns to Players, Transforming the African Identity by Mkawasi, Mcharo Hall. Please help me with the time. I would hate to come and stand in front of you, but you've got exactly 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I make this presentation with great caution, as one would walking among masters, because some of my best teachers have come from this institution. And I know that exchanging ideas has been greatly informed by intellectual material that I have learned in here. Pawn to Players, Rethinking African Identity Through Irrational Belonging. So I take a departure from Paul Zeleza's vision for the future of Africa, which urges a shift, that Africa must stop being pawns and become strategic players. Of course, the first thing I thought of as a chess player myself is once the pawn becomes a major player, moves off the chessboard and becomes a more powerful piece, then it has to move back onto the chessboard. What do you do with identities that are promoted, that are transitioned to higher places, to more power, yet we have to still play within the systems that cripple us? I use this idea as a launching pad to explore how identity has kept Africa vulnerable, and how a radical reimagining of African identity, what I call irrational belonging, can catalyze a continental transformation. This global chessboard that keeps coming to mind, if in fact we have to make a move from pawns to players, then it means we have to find a way of creating a kind of political superpositioning where we are in two places at the same time. How do we do this? How does Africa do this? From many years back, I remember reading on economy magazines, Africa Rising, Africa Rising. Year after year, it will be Africa Rising. It's as if we'd go all the way to the edge. Something good would happen, and then we'd get right back on the chessboard, and as if we'd go all the way back. So what I figured is that once a pawn gains the powers that it does, as I see here, what I see is a lot of intellectual power, absolute power. Yet we carry with us the memory of pawnness. We carry with us that trauma, which Professor Zeleza writes so well about, and which we cannot ignore. So the problem of identity, African identities have been authored, transacted, and constructed, often by outsiders. These identities are not immutable. They're tools of manipulation. I read Mudibe's work, where he talks about Africa as an invented notion. And we know that the colonization and missionary lenses have taken a big role in creating this African identity, the political Africa that we know now. And then there's Wilderson, Frank Wilderson, who I think sometimes you have to be brave enough to read him, fight with him in a dark room, and come out and start figuring out the idea of the black identity, which is trapped in a master-slave matrix. Then I go back to see what Professor Zeleza has to say about this. The fact that Africa shapes its own identities too, and these are fluid, that we can get out of that master-slave matrix, because for centuries we have also been masters of forming our own identities. So my irrational belonging theory, which I have had the good fortune of testing out with different scholars and different leaders in decision-making places, this theory of irrational belonging rests on three claims: that all identity is authored, all identity is transactional, and all identity is constructivist. It challenges us to see identity not as a sacred and fixed place, but as negotiable and redefinable. At its purest form, identity is irrational, free from self-interest. Before it's defined by politics or imposed narratives, this irrational core is the reset point where Africans can reclaim authorship of their own stories. Pan-Africanism, this is a notion that it's one of the most slippery notions, but the more I look at the current generation, the more I realize how much of a grasp they have on it. So I take off from Zeleza's envisioning of planetary consciousness where Africa shapes, not just reacts to global systems. Classical Pan-Africanism imagines a united Africa. That ideal isn't dead, it's evolving. Today's youth are more global-minded, more digital, less wedded to borders. Pan-Africanism is no longer just a political thing. It's not just the classical issue that we know. It's cultural, it's intellectual, it's creative, and that's where Africa's agency lies. Now, one of the most important points, and I think this brings me to concluding my condensed thoughts, is epistemic reclamation. Now, Professor, I had to read this over and over again to really get where you're going. And when it hit, I said, yes, yes, yes. Now, Africa must overcome epistemic marginalization, bringing African knowledge systems to the center. This requires institutions that train leaders in Africa-centered governance and philosophy. No African leader should lead without understanding the intellectual and historical foundation of their people. This is how we stop electing pawns. Because then we stop having PhD presidents and people who've gone to school that get to the edge, take us to places, we celebrate this moving from pawn to queen, and suddenly we start to move back. Because there is a memory that we haven't collected from the past. There is an African epistemological dying that we have accepted to go into. We have cultural knowledges. We have knowledge systems, African knowledge systems. I hope if Professor Zeleza has students here, I hope they really read those books, because you need to read them. Figure out how we can get these intellectual systems a part of our moving forward as Africans, because they begin to move us off of the chessboard, off of the system that keeps us down, no matter how far we go. Finally, in Smoldering Ashes, Zeleza explores the deep scars of colonialism and the struggle for identity in post-independent Malawi. And through the tragedy of a character called Ntolo and his grandson, we see how foreign powers define both land and spirit, leaving communities fractured. A traditional and Christian ritual clash at a funeral, and the story reveals a haunting truth that the poor carry the weight of erased histories. A lady stands there, and when they're trying to figure out, should we carry on with this funeral in a Christian way or in a traditional way? This lady says, well, you know, somewhere in the past, before intervention, I heard that women used to be priests. And the villagers look and say, well, forget that. We're doing it the Christian way. And that is where the failure comes in. The failure to take this responsibility of carrying our knowledge systems and looking at what we had and seeing the power that was within them and seeing what we have now and what we have learned and merging it and coming to a place where we say, we don't need the chessboard that has been imposed on us. We can move to the end. We can become both the players and the pieces on the chessboard. So we create ideas, decisions, and policies that are within our own interest. Thank you very much. Happy birthday, sir.
With exactly 6 minutes to spare. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, how interesting that we are gathering today, and particularly on this theme, Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance, that in about an hour, South Africa is going to be meeting with America, which is our president and his entourage. We'll be meeting with Trump and his entourage, where these very same concepts are going to be put to the test. Whether are we going to sell our soul today, or we are going to honor the pioneers of these concepts and fight for our own sovereignty and walk out of that place respected as equals. We will know, but it's at about half past 11. Let me now call upon Shomarka Keita to speak on Paul Zeleza, Africa, African diaspora, Pan-Africanism, and the issue of definitions. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. I'll say thank you for the conference. And would you please tell the people with the slides to move them? I don't have a laptop with me. I didn't know the exact arrangements. In the meanwhile, I'm going to tell a story. I was commenting to my other half.
Just a second.
Fine. Yeah,
Do I need to say something? Yeah, just say next.
Oh, okay. I was telling my other half about how good President Zeleza looked. I met him, we met a few years ago at USIU in Kenya, and she told me that's because he eats goat meat. And I said, I will not be joining him. Okay, so you know, we will lighten this up. This is the Bible translated into Yoruba. Into Yoruba. There are Bibles that were translated into Maasai, into Kipsigis. So, if we can have a Bible that's full of places and ideas that were not Yoruba, that are not Kipsigis or Maasai, then why can't we have an anatomy book written in Maasai or Kipsigis? When I posed this at the biological anthropology meetings, and I'm here today actually as an Africanist biological anthropologist, not so much as a physician, even though my home is listed as a hospital. One of the PhD students says, oh, well, but we don't have language to do this. And I said, well, you've been butchering cows for 3,000 years. I said, what do you call this? Well, so-and-so, she was from Rwanda. Well, what do you call this? And then it went off in her head. She said, we do have names for these anatomical parts. I said, yes. So you can write that book in your own language, the way Ngugi wa Thiong'o would say. Okay? I'm going to sum up my points before I go on to say that my first section would be Africans, Zeleza's view. His view is that the African Union is what defines Africa. That is his view. My view will contain some other ideas about the emergence of phenomena in Africa as African. The African diaspora flows naturally from this notion of the African Union. So it means we can no longer simply talk about the Black Atlantic or talk about the diaspora as the results of the human trafficking trade. We have to talk about Algerians in France, Egyptians in Australia, Egyptians in Iraq. Those are all parts of the African diaspora. Pan-Africanism often defaults, because of the matrix that was talked about, the black-white matrix, into pan-blackism. That will not necessarily appeal to many people in various parts of Africa who don't use black as a moniker for themselves, even when they, to our own eyes, they look black. Recall the conversation that Malcolm X had on the airplane with the Algerian, who said to him, well, what's your philosophical, political philosophy? Malcolm said, black nationalism. And the man said, well, look at me. And Malcolm said, well, to all eyes, he looked like a white man. So the question becomes, what is African? Okay, and how do we define it? Professor Zeleza has given us one way. I'm going to add a little bit to that. Zeleza's work on Africa is expansive in scope. He demonstrates the potential for the applicability of scholarship. This presentation will briefly explore aspects of some of the issues that Zeleza has raised. Thought about Africans is still influenced by Western ideas. This is manifest in various ways, including how the continent is treated in historical texts, how its people are conceptualized, the placement of its various regions in academic departments and museums, and academic journals. It even includes what will be counted as African by the International Monetary Fund versus the World Bank. Notions about Africanity have employed geography, physical traits called race, and language, with older Western theories continuing to have influence, sometimes with little African critique. For Zeleza, Africa is the Africa of the African Union. Often the idea of what Africa is and Africans are is confined to what is commonly called the sub-Saharan region, sometimes so-called Black Africa. Interestingly, the name Africa, next slide please, and then the next slide. The name Africa was first applied and restricted to the northern region in what are now Algeria and around Tunisia, above the Sahara. The name itself may be of Amazigh African Berber origin, but this is uncertain. This is the Africa of the Romans and early Christian thinker St. Augustine, who was also an African. In the Islamic period, it is called Afriqiya. Later, Africa got extended to the entire continent, contiguous landmass, some islands, and restricted to the eastern border of the Sinai Peninsula, although there is no logical reason to have done this. A concept of Africasia is just as legitimate as Eurasia, but African scholars have yet to develop this idea. New constructs are encouraged by the work of Professor Zeleza. The issue of Africanness was important in Nasser's Egypt. Ismail, after expressing common ideas about African geographical, racial, and cultural division and Egypt's separation from sub-Saharan Africa, both rooted in writers such as Hegel and Seligman, recounts the Egyptian position on Africanity under Nasser, and this is a quote: "To overcome these difficulties, Egypt attempted to identify its ancient civilization as African in origin. Egyptian spokesmen emphasized the racial mixture that is apparent in Upper Egypt. They also claimed that the supposed racial difference between Africa south of the Sahara and Arab in the north was a tool of imperialism to create a rift and a division. Hussein Sabri declared, 'Here I want to state quite emphatically that Arab North Africa, and history attests to it, has always had relations with countries south of the Sahara and vice versa. We have mixed blood in our veins. I shouted to the world, and I am proud of it.' Ismail seems to intimate that there was something problematic about this. These comments from 1950s Egypt reveal a time of Pan-Africanism concerned primarily with liberation struggles and decolonization, and a view of Pan-Arabism as being compatible with or a part of that Pan-Africanism. They also reveal that Egypt officially thought it needed to show an organic connection, not just a structural, geographical connection with other Africans. The organic connection is real. Current evidence supports that the ancient and or modern Egypt is coextensive with other African populations by genealogy, language family, and not just by mixture, which does create relationships, as was stated. Ancient Egyptian culture did arise locally in the Nile Valley. The acceptance of Islam, the Arabic language, and biocultural assimilation of non-Africans did not lead to population replacement in the northern tier of Africa. This is true for other regions in northern Africa. Okay, here we go. I propose some new perspectives that still use geography, but without Western language baggage. First, the notion of North Africa as a capitalized entity projected infinitely back into the past can be dropped. The proposed change still focuses on geography. More specifically, if the Sahara is retained as an orientation zone, we can speak of supra-Saharan, Saharan, and infra-Saharan regions. If the tropic latitude lines are used as reference points, we can define a tropical Africa between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Note that they overlap, but they are not the same. Further refinements, such as considering quadrants or geographical features such as rivers, valleys, or mountains, can be used. These focus our attention differently. Immediately, one can see, if you look at the other map, that Egypt is primarily in the Sahara, not north of it, and that major parts of other countries commonly called sub-Saharan are actually in the Sahara, or not completely below it. The area between the tropic lines encompasses diverse ecological and cultural regions. Further inquiry is revealing, given the racialization of Africa. In super-Saharan Africa during the Greco-Roman period, there's evidence for skin color variation based on text and iconography, as noted by various writers. The concept of emergence is useful here because it avoids the trap of enumerating static traits to create a definition of Africa and Africans. The view taken here is that things that emerge from some core African biological or cultural sources and have been shaped foundationally in Africa are African. Thus, we can speak of biological and biocultural Africanness without any notion of essentialism. Africa is diversity. There are many ways to be African. The term endogenous, as used by the late Pauline Hontunji, is useful. He made the distinction between it and indigenous, which he interprets as implying by its common usage as something local, static, or even incapable of change without losing authenticity. Endogenous in his usage incorporates the idea of agency and improvisation and creation of the new or different, using local and non-local ideas and materials, producing something equally African, depending on the agency of the people doing it and who is doing it. The problem of limiting Africa across its disciplines one can find recent reports of interviews of a noted geneticist who even used the phrase, the continent of sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan became synonymous with Africa, which is incorrect. Based on physical appearance, it would be easy to believe that the regions of Africa have no genealogical connections with one another. However, as of this writing, the evidence of Y chromosome analysis shows that there's a male genealogical lineage that connects the regions. Next slide, please. Next. Next. Sorry. Next slide, please. Next. Y chromosome has a section in the middle that's passed only from father to son. It only changes by mutations, not by exchange with the X chromosome, except the ends of the Y chromosome. Occasionally, an accident happens and you get that SRY gene, which determines maleness, does get onto an X chromosome. So you have somebody who is XX, molecularly female, but anatomically male. If you saw the movie Conclave, the new pope, sorry, to spoil it for you, at the end, it turns out that he was one such person. Next, please.
Could you use one of the wireless microphones?
Oh, I'm sorry. Next. Next. So the male-specific region accumulates mutations, and based on those mutations, we can construct a genealogy of the whole human living species. Next, please. This E haplogroup family tree is Pan-African. It's Pan-African. And the E1B1 haplotype or marker, P2, is deep within the tree. It's not at the top. E1 and E2 don't define below and above the Sahara or anything like it. Next slide, please. This E haplogroup P2 marker is the ancestor of E1B1A and E1B1B. As you can see, the E haplogroup is predominant or plural in all of the regions of Africa. So for those who like to say things like, oh, well, those people don't look African, there's no such thing. There's no one way to look African. There's no one way to be African, even in terms of genealogical genetics, for those who think that that's important. It would be sufficient to use political and ideological reasons to do Pan-Africanism, but guess what? We also have this other piece. And for those of you who are interested in antagonizing other people, you see that this E haplogroup got out into Southern Europe 20,000 years ago, across the Mediterranean and into the Near East. So we can find it today. It did originate in Africa too. It's not a mistake. So you have a drop of the African blood. Next, please. For those who find that interesting, it can be used in various ways too, by the way. Considering the whole of Africa means understanding that its diasporas are not to be confined to the common discourse related to the descendants of those trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean, as Professor Zeleza has taught us. The term tertiary diaspora can be used to make a distinction between the various diasporas of early archaic and modern human dispersal and later migrations. It must include not only those dispersed through trafficking, but all those from the African continent. Communities, I would define the tertiary diasporas or construct subdivisions of it in the following way. One, communities that are self-conscious of having migrated from elsewhere and acknowledge this, may be proud of it or not, but can be described as diaspora. Communities are people who may be aware of likely origins from elsewhere to some degree, in whatever degree, but that do not use it in an identity formation or have no interest in it and do not acknowledge it. The third, communities are individuals that have origins or ancestry other than where they are, but may not know it. And this group can be included what I call the molecular diaspora. So you have people walking around in Spain who say, well, the Moors are here, but they're not connected to us. There's no distinct Moorish communities. Ah, but there's that M81 that you saw in the diagram, which is the signal of the past. Pan-Africanism As I noted earlier, the idea or ideology that African states and people should unite in various ways, initially to free themselves from colonialism and then to foster economic success through cooperation, is an ongoing project. But also, how we think about the interconnections of Africa is an ongoing project. I've already mentioned the story of Malcolm X and the Algerian, and so I don't need to repeat that. Pan-Africanism must include a range of actions. As Pauline Huntunji noted, African wealth was not only diamonds, gold, hardwoods, oil, the exploitation of its labor, but also the materials with which to produce new knowledge. We have a phenomenon going on now called parachute research or helicopter research. Investigators from rich countries drop into village X, take samples, get DNA, do whatever they do, and they leave. And they get paid for this. They get fame, okay? They get promotions, with Africans benefiting not so much. Next slide, please. Zeleza's work does not avoid critical engagement with the legacies of colonialism and colonialist thinking, no matter which institutions or scholars are involved. Africa and all of its diasporas have not fully freed themselves of the legacies of colonialist thought and racial thinking. Some may ask, does scholarship really matter? The answer is yes. Patrimony is both the land, the mind, and its actions. Decolonization is not just an issue of how you think about things. It is about land. It is about material. It is about the wealth as well. Persistence and creativity led to legacy. Afro-North American teenage women, Nikiah Jackson and Calcia Johnson, defined mathematical proofs that were said to be unsolvable or even impossible. Next slide, please. Their work is said to have implications not only for mathematics, but other branches of knowledge. So now, as the collective work of Paul Zeleza's suggestion, and Tunji would agree, the task is not only to be inspired by them, next slide please, but to use their work and to systematically look for others like them. Push for other important work in the service of ongoing justice in and development of Africa. The value of Zeleza's studies of the diaspora and African economies, coupled with a belief in the possibility of an emergent new reality, can promote a transformation. It can lead to a different awareness. For example, African, Kenyan, South African, and Tanzanian students and the public may gain a different perspective after they learn that there were prosperous Africans in India hundreds of years ago, thus breaking any crisis of confidence in the current situations of economic and knowledge disparity between themselves and the Indian descendants in their own countries. The Indians might change as well. Empowering the purposeful and strategic interaction between contemporary diasporas could lead to mutual economic benefits and respect at local and national levels, but this will require understanding, as Zeleza has said, that not all diasporas view themselves in the same way. The task is to develop the language that breaks down these barriers. Thank you. Happy birthday to you. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. I think we're going backwards. Oh, there you go. And next slide. And this is why we do this work. These are my kids, of course. In Kenya. Habari gani?
I'm sure you can appreciate how difficult to be an African child to tell an adult to stop, the time is over. Now, can I have the, oh yeah, the program is bad. No, but we are very good on time. So I'm going to call, because I don't have this, let me read it. Number 4, please. This one is Ubuntu Beyond Borders, a pluralist investigation of its semantic and pragmatic variations and epistemological applications. The presenter will be Brennan Standel.
Is there a HDMI? Is that?
Oh,
that's just a charger, I think.
The slides across the hall.
Okay. Can I give them my computer?
Let me call the next presenter.
I think we're going to have the same problem. So do we just run over, I give them my computer, and, or can I plug in right there?
Yeah, I think you can plug in right there.
Okay. Okay, one second.
Because you said that those extra minutes were saved up, I wanted to emphasize certain things because I included this biology and stuff in here.
Okay,
A lot of people
okay,
don't know. That's
okay.
why.
And by the way, the poem that you had at the beginning of the program is by David Diop, born in 1927 in France, but he passed away in 1960 in an airplane accident. That was David Diop's poem. It's called Africa. You wanted to emphasize something, right? You can come and emphasize. You wanted to? Yeah.
I was just
you're done.
saying-
Okay.
No, you're going to ask questions later. You want
Okay,
them to
that's
ask me
fine.
questions now.
No.
They'll ask questions later.
Later, yes. Yeah. I think we're good.
Yes. All right, getting a little exercise in too. All right, so today you're getting, for the price of 4 speakers, 5. So special deal today. My name's Brennan Standel. I'm representing our research team, Dr. Leo and Dr. Janine. One sec. And I first ran into Dr. Zeleza's work when reading an article for my in my sophomore year of undergrad with geographies of underdevelopment and development. I believe it was the article discussing post-independent universities, African universities and their studies. And the fact that a sleep-deprived and highly caffeinated undergrad still remembers that article is a testament to Dr. Zeleza's writing. So I'm honored to be a part of this and hoping to contribute to the conversation that he and many others have pioneered and pushed forward. Next slide. So today we're going to go through the introduction and purpose of our work, the methods that we did to find out what we found out, go through key findings, and talk about future directions and conclude. Next slide, please. So what is Ubuntu? Ubuntu is a foundational Bantu concept that's tied to community, reciprocity, dignity, and justice as well. It's commonly translated to I am because we are. It commonly translated as I am because we are, somewhat in opposition to or in comparison to Descartes' I think therefore I am. Ubuntu varies linguistically and culturally across Africa, but consistently embodies a framework for human development. So our work looked at across Africa because what we found was the conversation around Ubuntu has been dominated by South Africa consistently. So we were curious as to what does Ubuntu look across the continent. My apologies if I'm a little scatterbrained. My notes were on my computer, so I'm going off of memory here. And so we wanted to take a look across Africa and look at Ubuntu. Next slide, please. So we did a strategic and structured keyword search across several databases looking for articles with Ubuntu or with words or concepts in embodying Ubuntu. We then, so we found 296 articles from these sources, and then collectively broke them down and brought them down to 118 selected for full text review. From these, we extracted out Ubuntu terms that the articles and authors stated as being Ubuntu, and put those into an Excel file where we extracted out information about the authors, about the term, location, and language surrounding it. We then took that information out of Excel and mapped it in ArcPro for thematic as well as linguistic patterns, and looked across the fields of research that these articles were being written in. Next slide, please. So what we found were 42 unique words for Ubuntu identified across 28 African countries. So 42% of Africa. Mostly concentrated in Southeast Africa as well as West Africa. And we found that there were 37 Bantu languages, 12 non-Bantu languages, 3 Afro-Asiatic, 1 Nilo-Saharan, and 1 Creolized Indo-European. So quite a spread of language sources for Ubuntu terms and terminology. And we also, in addition to the words themselves, we looked at proverbs and sayings that embodied Ubuntu, and found 32 sayings or proverbs that embodied Ubuntu and shared Ubuntu thought and ideology. So just to kind of conceptualize this and ground this, an example of it can be found in Osutu, from the Ma language of the Maasai, where for them, Ubuntu takes a slightly different definition because of their space. The Maasai, for them, herding is extremely significant. So Osutu came out of the birth of a cow, the umbilical cord that connects the calf to the mother. And so Ubuntu is the link between us all, the umbilical cord that ties us together. We are all linked, and so we are one in that sense through the umbilical cord. So it's taken Ubuntu and it's made its own within its own context. So that's an example of one Ubuntu term. Next slide, please. So we also found that South Africa is still very present and dominant in the production of Ubuntu scholarship, but there is a diversity of contributors across and around the world. It's still, citations are very dominated by South Africa, as well as non-African countries. There's a growing number of African countries who are publishing on Ubuntu. So temporally, you see like Ubuntu is growing in its publications, and we're also seeing that increasingly it's becoming more African in production of it. So countries, African countries are producing the articles and producing the knowledge. Next slide, please. And so this is so 74% of all the articles had an author who was affiliated with African institutions. 14% of those were non-African authors collaborating with African authors. And then the rest were non-affiliated at all with Africa. So you can see this relationship of collaboration in knowledge production within Ubuntu, where all the collaborations within Africa collaborated with South Africa to produce articles, but you also have global North countries collaborating with African countries all over. And you have a couple like surprises here and there, like Kazakhstan, Bangladesh, Thailand, and Indonesia getting together, and Amsterdam. So there's a growing interest in Ubuntu as a concept around the world. Next slide, please. So it's not only geographically diverse, but it is spread around multiple fields. We found that those articles represented around 15 academic fields, bridging theory and practice. So not just the traditional theology and philosophy that Ubuntu has traditionally held, but also, next slide, or education, next please. Business, next please. Decoloniality, next please. Environmental studies, next please. And even AI. This one is particularly interesting for me as Africans seek to not only have a seat at the table and be more than just passive observers, but active engagers and contributors to technological innovation. Taking something like AI, which has no moral framework, and adding a moral framework that ensures that AI serves everyone and serves the community rather than serving selfish resource crewment and devastation for the planet. Next slide, please. So the limits of this study, we used namely English language peer-reviewed journal articles. And so we were limited by that and what was accessible. So we didn't use books, or specifically, I think gray literature is probably the biggest gap, because we're very confident that if you go to any country in Africa, you can find Ubuntu, but that might not be published. It might just because of the academic infrastructure that may or may not be there. So there's blind spot there with gray literature. Manual coding and mapping introduce interpretive subjectivity, especially in multilingual contexts. And then we also have author positionality, next, and then next, double click, please. So authors, I'm originally from Nigeria, and then Dr. Janine is from Burundi, and Dr. Leo is from Malawi. We all speak African languages, but those languages may lean us one way and obfuscate other languages and bias us towards the languages we know. Next slide, please. But there is a lot of potential and a lot of growth for this research. We've identified Ubuntu terms and Ubuntu words, and now we want to find out the why and the how they're there. So to do that, we would love to integrate African cultural practices and local language expressions, because we gathered these proverbs, and these proverbs are very rich, but we didn't quite know how to integrate them into the discussion quite as well, because the lack of academic literature surrounding them. So that is an area for growth. Then to explore the why and how these Ubuntu terms got where they are. We want to look at diffusion model of linguistics to explore the story, the behind the scenes of how Ubuntu got to a particular country. Did it come out of Bantu, or was it a divergent evolution? where it just sprung up in that particular space. And then we also, within that, we also want to explore core and periphery continuum, so kind of similar concept. And then expand, we would love to expand sources to gray literature and add survey work. Every time I've told someone about this work, they go, oh yeah, I have something like that in my language. And they tell me their word for Ubuntu. And so there's a genuine and real excitement that's behind this with Africans and even outside of Africa. So next slide, please. So Ubuntu it's more than a concept. It's a living framework of interdependence, dignity, and collective care. And we believe that it is a form of, it's a radical idea, especially in this day and age, that can meaningfully contribute not just to African thought, but to the world. And so it reminds us that I am because we are is not just a proverb, but it is a proposition for how might we live, learn, and lead together. And we could use a lot more of that in today's age. Next slide, please. So thank you, and then next slide. I just want to acknowledge the folks that made this possible. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. And with 30 seconds to spare, yeah, can I just see I'll call it just now. Can I see the program? Interesting. I just want to say something with regard to how you concluded on that, because I come from the culture where Ubuntu comes from. And when you say African cultural practices and language expressions. So in our language, in Zulu, we say, isisu somhambi singangenso yenyoni. It means the traveler's stomach is as small as that of a bee. And how does that come about? If a traveler has been traveling long distances and gets to a point where it is at night and cannot travel anymore, and they would look for a flickering light in the village and they will spot a homestead where there is a light, they will come there and they will announce themselves, it's already at night, and say, hi, blah, 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 isisu somhambi asingakanani singangenso yenyoni. Meaning, the traveler's stomach is so small and equals that of a bee. What does that mean in terms of Ubuntu? It says, I can't travel anymore. I am tired, I am hungry, and I need a place to sleep. So Ubuntu in us kicks in. You go and get the person right at the gate. You give that person a place to sleep, a hut, give them water to bath, and then you give them food to sleep. To eat. In the morning, they will say thank you, then they will continue with their trip. That is Ubuntu in lived cultural experiences. And I just thought I should just explain, because sometimes we talk about these concepts and then you ask yourself, how does it manifest itself? What does it really mean to practice Ubuntu? That is just one example. So the next presenter, I like pronouncing your name, is Oluwakemi Damola Adejumo Aibiowu. Yes.
To save the stress, just call me Dr. Damola. Good morning and congratulations to Prof. Happy birthday. And to the organization, to the organizers of the program. I stand on existing protocol. I'm a Nigerian, but I come from University of South Africa today. I'm doing my postdoc research at the the Studies Department. I'll be speaking on the paper, African Development Agenda and the African Renaissance, Insight from Paul Zeleza. I'll just be echoing Professor's voice in this paper. And I want to say that we are the younger scholars that are echoing your voice. I don't think we are doing anything extraordinary than taking it forward. Yeah, the overview, my paper examines African development. Next, please. I examine African development agenda through the African Renaissance. This study seeks to critically interrogate the philosophies and strategies underpinning Africa's contemporary development agenda. It argues for a culture-centered development approach, and it draws on Paul Zeleza's critique. Next, please. Yeah, we've mentioned Africa several times today, but I want to remind us that in the media and even in people's mind, Africa often portrayed through poverty, debt, weak governance. When we talk about Africa, we remember corruption, autocratic government. We hardly remember Africa for something really great most time. And then when we see the current Africa, the question is this what the nationalists fought for? When people were dying in the 1950s, was this what they hoped for? The current Africa is totally different from what the nationalists laid their life for. Next, please. So, despite the ambitions, we still have poverty. We have more than 40% of Africans finding it hard to make a living. Next slide. So, I go to the next slide, which is conceptualizing African Renaissance. I think I missed a slide there, but I will talk through it. Is it that Africa, we are doing nothing? No, there are so many agendas. And notable among them is the NEPA 20 that was instituted in 2001 and the Agenda 2063, all by the African Union. In other words, the African leaders have come together to develop notable agendas to address this problem. 2001 till date should be like how many years now? Like 34 years of NEPAD. And Agenda 2063, which was launched in 2013. 2013 till now, mathematicians help me. Yeah, both of those agendas, 2013 is now almost 20 years. And none of this agenda, well, there could be progress, but we've seen slow progress. And when we compare African progress to Asian development, we'll see that our progress is nothing to write home about. And the progress that Africa has now is not sufficient to bring the desired change, the Africa we want, according to Agenda 2063. So, both of this agenda, they claim to be anchored on African Renaissance. So what is African Renaissance? Renaissance denotes a rebirth, renewal, reawakening. And many times we link it with, we associate it with European Renaissance. But African Renaissance is totally different from European Renaissance, even though both of them we had some similarity. For example, European Renaissance started at a time when they were going through their own crisis, just like Africa is in crisis. Africa has always been in crisis. Slave trade crisis, colonization crisis, neo-colonization crisis. However, the Renaissance of European led to capitalism, colonization, destruction on African culture. That cannot be our own Renaissance. Our own Renaissance is to be self-reliant and to bring back our culture that were destroyed by colonial interest. So the African Renaissance is thus conceptualized as a comprehensive cultural, political, and economic renewal that emphasizes indigenous values, collective identity, and self-determined development. I'm sure if we, like the last speaker talked about Ubuntu, that is the core culture of African. Communalism is a common core in all African culture. I think I have to just move through this slide. The history of African Renaissance is in my paper. It's linked to the speech of Isaka Seme in 1908 when he said that Africa needs a spiritual and moral awakening. So one of the characteristics of African Renaissance is that it's spiritual. You cannot remove spirituality from the African man. And removal of spirituality is one of the things that make African policy abstract and ineffective. Next slide, please. I also link African Renaissance to Pan-Africanism, which remains its political and ideological backbone. Pan-Africanism calls for continental unity, economic liberation, and the elevation of African values in the face of globalization and neo-colonial domination. We all know that Pan-Africanism led to the independence, political independence of African states from the 1950s, starting from Ghana. However, Pan-Africanism have not led to the economic liberation of African states, which bring the Renaissance in. Renaissance calls for reawakening of our culture, demolished and destroyed, subjugated by colonial interest. And even though we got the political independence, even our mentality, our mindset, which controls our economy and every aspect of our life, need to be liberated. We need the Pan-Africanism of our mindset. So I've talked about what African Renaissance is, but I define it in this paper as the desperate, deliberate reawakening of African cultural and intellectual heritage to inform governance, development strategies, economic system, and central to this definition is the agency of African people, particularly intellectuals and leaders, to craft context-specific policies and mobilize the political will to implement them effectively. Next slide, please. Oh, I've gone further than the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I dedicated a session on Zeleza's perspective on this issue of African Renaissance, especially when it relates to the agenda or development agenda of the African Union. The first things I draw from Professor Zeleza's perspective is the limitation of externally imposed models. Zeleza argues that African development crisis is not due to absence of policy, but rather the lack of political capacity and ownership in implementing homegrown solutions. He critiqued the persistent reliance on externally imposed models and the way international institutions, particularly the World Bank, have undermined African development initiative. Next, please. Furthermore, Zeleza emphasizes that African development is often framed as a technical process, ignoring the role of culture and history. So he argues that meaningful development must be rooted in cultural context, collective memories, and aspirations of African people. He also mentioned, next please, Zeleza also highlighted the contradiction between Africa's rhetorical commitment to participation and the reality of early driven policy processes. As I will still talk about NEPAD in the future, in the next session rather. Lastly, Zeleza champions the idea of right to development as a human right that embodies civil, political, social, and cultural freedoms. He writes that this right refers to both the process of development and to its outcome, insisting that it must be participatory, equitable, locally grounded, and internationally respected. Next slide, please. So after that section, and based on this perspective, I critique Africa development trajectory. I'll be fast about that. The two issues I brought out about African development trajectory, because we are full of agendas. And what is wrong with our agenda? Why is our agenda not materializing? The first one is that most of the African agendas that are being implemented when it comes to development are externally imposed. And we need to differentiate between homegrown and country ownership. Homegrown is when we look at our situation by ourselves and develop solutions from within ourselves that targets the challenge. Country ownership is when somebody sits down in Washington and design a template for Africa and then come and do maybe seminars and a town hall meeting of how it's going to work, and then we all sign and they say we own it. What we have seen in the history of Africa since development is that those development agendas that are developed by our own intellectuals based on our reality are hardly funded. We always claim we don't have fund. And then we go back to the colonizers, and they always say, no, it's not, because it's not going to go with colonial interest. And maybe I should digress that Africa was created for colonial interest. Every country in Africa was named based on colonial interest. And we have been fulfilling those agendas forever. Even in countries that they are having war every time, they still export their treasures, their crude oil, their diamond, non-stop. No war has stopped the exploitation in those countries. Africa has forever been an exploitative venue for colonial interest. So when we have our homegrown strategy and it does not align with the colonial agenda, it is not going to be supported. And we also claim we don't have the capacity. The second, next please. Next slide, please. I'm already in another slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, something is freezing there. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll continue. Okay, so I talked, that is what I call structural dependency. And then the second is the leadership crisis. Leadership crisis is our unwillingness to even explore our opportunities, the intellectual knowledge, the indigenous knowledge system that we have. So when we say we don't have capacity, it's because we don't have the willpower. And the political system that we inherited from the colonial government, which we are managing and we are, improving upon, creates a political system that allow, I don't want to use the word hooligans, like the political element taking over are people who are still going to serve colonial interest. Given this crisis, what is the solution? Towards a culturally rooted renaissance, we need to go back to our culture, and the challenge for African intellectual is to go deep into the culture. If you destroy a man's culture, you destroy his existence. Our culture is not just in wearing African fabric and dancing. In our culture are governance solutions. In our culture are social solutions. In our culture are financial solutions. And for me personally, since my PhD, it has been a concern, and all my projects have been targeted, not just talking about culture is important, but to develop cultural models that can be used to solve local problems. I developed a good governance model based on Yoruba culture that can be used to reform the Southwest Nigeria and the nation as a whole. When I look at that model, I know one of the things that will kill any model is finance. You don't give a model to a colonizer to fund. I recently developed a financial model in which we can raise funds to solve developmental challenges based on Ubuntu. And I will keep on researching African culture to develop solutions. For now, it may be in the library, But maybe before I become 70 like Prof, somebody's going to use it. Thank you.
Can we give another round of applause to all these presenters? Yeah. And another round of applause to me. I think we've managed the times very, very well, yeah. I will take 3, maximum 4 questions from the floor, and I'm going to ask you, when you ask the question, please get to it so that we manage the time. Because they've already presented. So no need for another presentation this side, just the question, right? But whilst I'm recognizing the hands, I'm going to ask you at the end to answer this one question that I'm going to put to you. What do you think, Dr. Zeleza, Dr. Zeleza's response will be if a question was put to him saying, the concept of Pan-Africanism was first punted in the mid-19th century, and then African Renaissance around 1940s, 1950. And we are still talking about it today. Do you think he will say it has been achieved or not? Is he happy or is he not happy with the progress that we have made on these 2 concepts that we have dealt with? So that's at the end. Yeah, think about that. Pretend that he's not here. Okay. So now I'm going to take questions. Let me pass on these mics. I don't know whether there's a roving mic. Oh, yeah, there is one here. Yahweh, can you help me with that? Oh, so you're the first, eh? So there's this question. There's one at the back, 2 that I've seen so far. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all for your presentations. My name is Yawasari at the Department of African Studies. My first question goes to Dr. Pardon me, I missed out on your name, but you did talk about how Prof. Zeleza mentions that his Africa is the Africa of the African Union. And in there, I'm wondering what then does that mean when, for instance, the African Union itself is excluding, it speaks of the African diaspora, yes, but when Haiti applied to join the African Union, it denied it in 2016. So I'm wondering, what then do we make of that when, Prof. Zeleza's Africa is of the African Union? And my last question is actually like a comment. I think you made connections between Ubuntu and René Descartes, I think therefore I am. And I think that's totally erroneous because René Descartes, I think therefore I am, is he's even doubting the existence of his body before he comes into that conclusion. I don't think in Ubuntu, like Africans are doubting the material existence. It's like there should be like harmony with all. So I think that connection, I think in future times should not be made.
Thank you so much. Let me take the next question. We'll come back to it.
Oh,
yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was bringing it to you.
Yeah. And then another question. Then
I'll make a
answer.
statement, then that will be the question I will ask you about the statement. Mm-hmm. When I was helping Shaka Stephen build the APC 1961 to 67 in Sierra Leone, where the opposition party finally got one from a governing party, first time, March 1967, he was so impressed with my action, he would say, I will be of all the youth who will lead Sierra Leone later president. Every time he said that, in private and public, this is what I said to him, and I want you to comment on it. I say, Pa, I am not ignorant and stupid. Anyone who thinks he or she can lead, make African countries modern state without being part of Kwame Nkrumah, United States of Africa, is ignorant and stupid. I have 60 years that have confirmed me. What do you think about that statement?
So you've noted that. I'll take the last one, then I'll come back to you. Please, okay. Sure.
My name is Dr. I'm from Malawi. Happy birthday, Professor Zeleza. I have a question. Thank you so
development. There will be no development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So we've got the three questions. There was also a comment. I think let's start in the order that they were asked.
Okay, so small correction, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a lowly master's student, recently graduated. So if anyone's hiring in DC area, let me know. So to your point about Ubuntu, how Ubuntu relates to African Union, and I think what you're getting at is that, oh, that's, okay.
Okay.
You were talking to me?
Okay.
Oh, okay, you used the wrong name. So your first question was about?
Yeah, it was like, you mentioned that
African, yes, okay.
This Africanist of the African Union.
Right.
And what that would be when the African Union is excluding even folks
Well,
in the diaspora when they apply to
The thing is that
Mike.
my understanding is that the Region 6 of the African Union does include the diaspora in toto. So if Haiti was specifically excluded, I don't know anything about that. I would find that odd, but in theory, by default, Haiti is a member because the 6th region, based on the latest documents, includes the entire diaspora. Now, and your other question was about Ubuntu?
No, and then the Ubuntu was a comment, like making the links between Ubuntu and René Descartes, I think therefore I am.
Okay, yeah. Well, that was his comment, but I don't, yeah, that was for him.
I think that can probably be a conversation me and you have later, if that's all right.
Thank you.
Just to give space.
And I would say, in terms of the issue of the diaspora, the implications in that work and some things that I did not get to elaborate on are that we have African diasporas in different places, and we don't always know about them. Okay? The question is, should that be operationalized in a very serious fashion? What does it mean? And I mean this very seriously. You have students in Kenya, for example, who, and they're Indian Kenyans, and they're African Kenyans, and, you know, Indian Kenyans were placed in an intermediary position, and they have more economic wealth, et cetera, et cetera. What does it do for those African Kenyans? And full disclosure, my kid's mom is from Kenya. She didn't learn anything about Africans in India. Okay, so what does it do? And now Indian Kenyans were made officially the 47th tribe of Kenya, effectively making them indigenous legally. So are they indigenous to Kenya, or are they a part of the Indian diaspora? It gets very interesting if you overthink it. You know, we don't have to overthink that. That's a political thing. The question is, how do we make use of that in terms of what she talked about in terms of development, internal ideas. Internal ideas can also include this diaspora. How do we call on? How do we do the transactional thing, if you will, with all of these diasporas, Afro-Brazilians, you know, people in different places? How do we connect this world?
Yes, I think there was another question.
Yeah. Can I answer a question? She asked me a question that reviewers have sent to me and bounced my paper, and I cried. And it's made me to even do further study. When I develop a cultural model, they say, can you show an example where it's been applied before? And then I will start from the global, then down. China today is the leading country in the world in terms of economy. And China's development and all Asian countries that have developed in the last 2 decades were based on their culture. I may not call it a Caucasian, how did they call that culture? The Caucasian culture of China was intrinsic to their education, to their governance, their language, and they created their model to suit their reality. And the result for not taking Bretton Woods idea is development. Now, I go down to cultural studies. Even though we say that governance and economy has failed in Africa, in rural areas, they still adhere to cultural indigenous system in terms of governance, in terms of self-help, community development, provision of facilities, and there are studies, I have documented studies that shows that cultural solutions are the respite of the poor. Lastly, when a reviewer sent me that same question, I was forced to do a study, which we review at the moment. What is the study? The security problem in Nigeria suddenly escalated in the last few years. And in 2002, in southwest Nigeria, the governors came together and they said they want to use indigenous police. That is the first time indigenous solution is institutionalized. I mean police that will be using juju. Have you heard of juju before? Now you laugh. See, now you laugh. Now you laugh because it sounds funny. But in the homes, were they not using it? For the mere fact that it's not in the Constitution, does that mean people are not using it? Does that mean people are not using spiritual bulletproof?
Thank you.
For the first time, they put it in their Constitution. They got them uniform. They regularized it. And then they started. So I conducted a thorough study of the effectiveness of this cultural police in 6 states. I did that. I sat down.
Out of time.
And today, it's still with review. I'm waiting, but it confirms that people prefer it more than the former police, and they've been effective. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask, the man is back. Remember that question? But he's not here. So you've got 10 seconds each. Answer the question I asked. Wait, did you have? Okay. Starting again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it working, the microphone?
Yes.
Okay, so the question was whether this concept of Pan-Africanism invented in the mid-19th century, followed by, the African Renaissance, the anti-colonial liberation movements and struggles, whether it has achieved its full potential or not, has been realized according to, that was the question, right?
The question was if we were to ask Dr. Zeleza, would he say he's happy or not? Just 2 seconds, please, because
to ask that question, right? If we were to ask that question,
yes,
to him, yeah. He's sitting here,
but he's not here.
We could just pass the mic to him. So based on my reading of his work, I think he would say no, it hasn't been.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say partially in terms of the issue of a certain type of decolonization, but not in terms of the full development project, nor in terms of discussing indigenous and other creative solutions, since we're not going to be able to recreate the colonial world that created surplus wealth that allowed Europe to do what it did.
Thank you.
I have the mic. I would say progress has been slow, but I wouldn't say no, because we are having decolonized intellectuals, which is the most important. 50 years ago, 40 years ago, most of our intellectuals went to colonial university and they were brainwashed to sell us more. Now our university system are being decolonized, and the more students that are graduating with a decolonized mindset gives Africa hope. Thank you.
Last one. Thank you.
I would say he would feel that the progress in Pan-Africanism has been very vibrant since the classical concept made its way in. It just hasn't been recorded. It hasn't been taught.
Thank you.
It's been very vibrant.
I'm sure he will find a way to sneak in that answer when he speaks at some point. Thank you so much. If I'm correct, the program director is coming back. He's going to tell us what's happening next.
Okay, excuse me. Excuse me. We'd like to thank the first panel and for the brilliant presentations. And we're going to take about 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11:40, and panel 2 will be presenting. Thank you.